You've got 10 minutes for one book and one idea. I'm Arena Williams. I'm a Labour MP, and I'm talking to Max Rachbrooke, a writer, this week about too much money. Kia ora, Max.
Kia ora.
Thank you for being with me to talk about Too Much Money. I love this book. It's a book that treats wealth inequality not just as something we should talk about from the perspective of poverty and how to do better for the people at the bottom, but also about what's going on for people at the top and how we might change people's attitudes to the whole system. Um, One thing I love about it is the way you write about class. Can you tell me why you started writing about that topic?
Well, I guess I'd been coming out of a world where we talked about inequality a lot, and that was a word the last decade, one started thinking about. But often when people talked about inequality, I realized it just meant poverty. Inequality being some people have got less than the average. And I realized that we hardly ever talked about the other half of that story, which is that a lot of people have got more than average. And I wanted to think about, well, okay, what does wealth look like in New Zealand? What does it mean to be wealthy? And how does that concentration of wealth at the top end lead to there being so little left for everyone else? And at times, this is slightly exaggerated, but I almost felt like I had to invent a new language.
Yeah.
Because we just don't talk very often about wealth and the wealthy in New Zealand. So it was almost a case of what words do I use to describe these people? So was it pushing into that and thinking, well, this is something we don't talk about enough. We need to talk about it, is kind of the motivation for the book.
I love that. And I love that you even dealt with the words that are sort of class signifiers in New Zealand. There is no one writing in the way that you do about how in modern Aotearoa, when we've had this myth about egalitarianism and the way that we talk about ourselves as New Zealanders and the stories that we tell our kids. And yet there are so many of these indicators, whether it's the way you talk, whether it's, I think you use in the book, sofa or couch as an indicator. How, when we've told ourselves over many, many generations, these stories about having a fair system, and when for some of our history in the right light that would have been true, you tackle what happened in the 1980s to destabilize that. And now we have generations of New Zealanders who have grown up in a very stratified society. How do we get our heads around that? And for people who've had a different experience in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to understand for a start that there've always been very inegalitarian trends within New Zealand. One of the things I talk about in the book, for instance, is that in 19th century South Island, New Zealand society, there was a real attempt to replicate the class structures of Britain with full-on aristocrats and people living in huge mansions and, socializing only amongst themselves. And we did manage to break that structure to a large extent. And we did found a society that was much more egalitarian in class terms. But there's always been that thread running through people's desire to separate themselves from each other and to think sort of badly of people who aren't like them. And in the 80s and 90s, when we had this big shift towards a much more individualistic view of the world, that kind of gave free rein to that. And so what I think you can see now in New Zealand is the regrowth of class distinctions. And by class, I mean the observable aspects. And that's often what people focus on. Yeah. People who sound different, who look different, they dress differently, they go to different places to eat, they have different cultural tastes. But what is lying underneath those observable characteristics is a whole set of advantages that cluster around particular groups or disadvantages. I mean, for me, that's what class is. It's people who've not just a certain level of wealth, but also education and access to housing and access to healthcare and all those benefits. And then they pass them on to their children. And that then gives you those groups that set apart from each other. And some of those groups have got much better access to opportunities than others. That's class, and that's the reality of New Zealand, I think.
That's cool. And let's come back to that because you've got this great idea of a ladder in the book representing these kind of transfers. When you have money, you can make other choices about whether you have political power or access to healthcare, access to education. But another sort of the images that I really liked that you talked about in the book was Albert Hirschman's idea of a tunnel that you have. Some people might be cute at a tunnel. Imagining the Wellington Tunnel, which I took this morning, and they're stuck in this lane, but they're watching people race past them on the other side, and they'll tolerate that to a certain extent because maybe their lane will get their turn later, or maybe they'll be able to pull out into the other lane. And this image in my mind of a New Zealand society where maybe we're even less prepared than other nations that have had this level of inequality for a much longer time, and it's been more entrenched in the way that they understand themselves to be. What is it about accepting this level of inequality and of a special lane for people with more access to the good things in life? And how do we think about that when we're making policy? What is a good way to bring people on board with the idea that they don't just have to tolerate some people getting special access?
Yeah, I think that explains a lot about New Zealand for me, that tunnel metaphor, and that's why I use it, because we have very significant levels of income and wealth disparities between people. The wealthiest 1% of New Zealanders own a quarter of the entire country. The bottom half of the population owns almost nothing.
Yeah.
And you would think, why are people so tolerant of that? But it is that, as per that tunnel metaphor, they see people going past more quickly and they think that'll be me eventually. So I'm not going to get too angry about the situation that I'm in. And the reality, I guess, that metaphor is gesturing towards is that, well, the perception is that New Zealanders feel like there are lots of opportunities, or lots of New Zealanders do. So they think, well, that my time will come. But the problem, of course, is that those opportunities aren't evenly distributed. That's my whole point about class, is that once you've got a certain level of wealth and a certain level of education, you then pass those opportunities on to your children, you help them into housing, you help them through university, and so on and so forth. And so actually those opportunities are quite unevenly distributed. And I think the task there for people who want to tackle that issue politically, firstly, is to make clear all the ways in which opportunity is unequally distributed.
Yeah.
But then also say to the people who are metaphorically waiting in the queue, you don't have to put up with that. You don't have to be so kind of stoic about this. You should actually be angrier about the fact that other people have so many more opportunities and are zipping past your high speed.
And you say anger there, and I think that is, um, that's a scary emotion for politicians to be dealing with. We on the right and the left, but for the left, we're so worried about that clash that you have from the public about that leads to that lack of social cohesion. That people will find a scapegoat in economic crisis, and we're seeing this around the world right now, whether it's with immigrants or with trans women, where people find something to be angry about when there is legitimate anger to be found, and it is in a system where this top 40,000 New Zealanders who have material wealth are more wealthy than 68 times the average New Zealander. That is unfair, and that is something to be angry about, but that anger gets displaced. And actually in your book you kind of tackle the way that people feel and the feelings about inequality over time. Were you surprised by some of those findings in the Ipsos studies that found that New Zealanders were reacting, differently than they had in the past to inequality and to that feeling that things are getting worse for the majority of people?
I wasn't surprised, because I think it's starting to become evident to people. This discussion we're having about class and wealth can seem quite abstract, but the practical application of it is thousands of people leaving New Zealand every month to go to Australia and other places like that.
Yeah.
And it's because people feel like there aren't the opportunities there anymore. And so some of that survey data says that, of course, New Zealanders still think that you get where you are in life substantially by your own efforts. That's still the dominant view. But increasing numbers of people from a low base think that it's important to be born into the right family or to have the right connections. And if they look at the world around them, I mean, that's a reasonable intuition. I mean, we all know now it's incredibly hard to buy a house unless your parents help you, for instance. And you can look at university courses, particularly law and medicine and things like that. They recruit almost entirely from the richest schools.
Yeah.
So a lot of opportunities are increasingly out of reach for ordinary New Zealanders. And look, you're right, anger is a tricky emotion, but I mean, the great community organizing structure is always anger, and then hope,
Yeah.
right? You've got it's anger is an absolutely legitimate emotion as long as you channel it ultimately into a positive direction, and it's not a way of sort of scapegoating people who are actually innocent in the situation.
Yeah, cool. Briefly, let's touch on what you wrote about the way that then the inequality entrenches itself within a political system. I was fascinated to learn that in 1972, 1 in 5 MPs in our parliament had a blue-collar job. Um, that is next to no one in this current parliament. How do you think we can, use the ideas of the latter, which you write about, to make sure that people aren't exchanging their material wealth, their money, for political influence?
Well, there's a number of different dimensions to that, and the one about the political composition of Parliament is really tricky because Parliament's become a much more diverse place in the last 50 years,
And it's a good thing?
which is an excellent thing in terms of gender and ethnicity and those kinds of things. But yeah, it has become, dominated by people from my kind of strata of the world, professional, middle, managerial class people. How you tackle that, I think, is complicated, and there aren't any easy solutions. The thing that I'm probably even more concerned about, though, is people from outside Parliament translating their wealth into power through things like lobbying and political donations, I would say, the two key channels. And what you really need to do to a large extent, I think, is to prevent that exchange, to block those channels, by which I mean limiting the amount that any individual can give a political party in a given year, and that might be $10,000 or $15,000, and creating total transparency about lobbying so that we know who is meeting whom and everything's out in the open, and people can't use those connections and that wealth in ways, that are in secret, in confidence, and that we don't have visibility about. Those are things I think we have to do to protect the integrity of our politics.
That's right. It's about having a democratic system, and if we don't have the same way to engage for everyone, and if some people have outsized influence, then we can't be surprised when we have policy which doesn't make sense in markets that don't work. Totally agree. Okay, that's about our time. Can you tell me, what are you reading at the moment?
So I'm really interested in the progressive era, which was sort of 1890 or so to 1920 in America.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in it because it's got a connection to inequality. That's a period when ordinary Americans mobilized, and in particular, they tackled the monopolists of their days, the people like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, men who owned colossal swathes of the American economy and utterly, utterly abused their power. And the progressives had a popular movement that took on the monopolists and absolutely smashed them, curbed their power profoundly. And what I want to know is, how did they do that? So I'm reading a whole lot of books around that area. The one I'm reading at the moment is by an academic called Maureen Flanagan. It's called America Reformed, and I'm learning a lot about what happened in that period and what worked.
Love it. I'm also interested in that period, but I've chosen a kind of different decade of interest at the moment, because with what's going on in the world at the moment, with just uh, a crumbling of some of the democracies that we like to compare ourselves to, I've gotten really interested in the 50s and 60s. Just finished an essay by Theodore Adorno, which is The Rise of New Right-Wing Extremism, which he was writing about Germany and the way that populist rhetoric had captured working people, but ultimately led to this road where further flow of wealth to capital, that was the conditions that they had created. And it feels like reading exactly the time that we are in now, and should be on everyone's reading list. Cool. All right, that's us.